when I started to study Kabbalistic texts, this was a rather curious and to the most people enigmatic undertaking. I was attracted, you know, some of you being psychologists, nobody knows what is going on in the hidden recesses of a man's mind. Somehow, having studied Judaism, I thought there must be something more than the pure Talmudic way in which I was interested and which I studied. And I somehow found myself attracted towards what was called Kabbalah, and couldn't find anybody who was able to explain to me, even among Orthodox Jews in Germany, a Kabbalistical text. So I had to grope my way by myself, which is called scholarship. When I wrote a dissertation in 21, after having shifted from mathematics to Semitic philology, I did my best, and I had a good fortune. My family was a printer's family, and the times were the times of German inflation, when nobody had the money to pay for the printing of a doctor's thesis. So my father said, if you can wait, we'll put it in between some orders, we'll squeeze it in, so you will have a book. So, okay, he printed my dissertation, and if I tell you that they printed 500 copies, it would be the truth and an overstatement as far as sales are concerned and as far as a reputation. So my reputation was somewhat curious, and I went to what is today Israel, and when they looked for the opening of the Hebrew University, they looked for people who would teach something which is not to be taught at all, namely because they didn't want teaching. There are too many people who had a PhD in Israel, and PhD being called the Jewish first name. And they liked to find fields which were not yet explored. And somebody told them, there is a young man here. You wouldn't even have to pay the transport. He is already there. And he is working about this field that nobody has really delved into it. So it's wonderful. Who can testify for his scholarship? There was nobody who was an expert. They looked around, and somebody told them there's a rabbi in Hungary who has said he has read Scholem's dissertation, one of the 200 copies sold before Hitler. My reputation. And they asked him, they wrote to him, have you read? Oh, he said, wonderful. This rabbi was a specialist in botany. And said, you sure appoint the right man. In his book, I have seen his book, he has written 2 pages about the bisexuality of the palm tree. This is wonderful. 2 pages on botanies in Kabbalism and Jewish tradition. These 2 pages are okay. You appoint him. So that by sheer, that's a way Jewish scholarship, maybe all scholarship developed. So this is how I came here. Now, Kabbalism, which has been my main preoccupation over the more than 50 years, is a vast storehouse of mystical and esoteric teachings developing out of the rich bathos of the rich ground of biblical traditions and imagery. It's a long story how these things develop. And among this vast literature, of which I was privileged to be mostly the first scholar who has ever read the texts, there are a lot of things which are of particular significance beyond the theosophical theories and structures of Kabbalistic thought or thoughts. After all, Kabbalah is not one system, as often is said, but is a vast variety of attempts to to give a symbolic structure to rabbinical Judaism. That's what it is about, basically, put in one word. So there are things which are on the borderline of the general Kabbalistic teachings, and it's about some points of this kind which I want to deal with in my lecture. I should have called it perhaps not the one name I gave to it. I might have better called it perhaps on the confrontation of man with himself and the doctrine of the astral body, because these are the 2 points which I am going to handle. Among the Kabbalistic teachings, which excuse me if I make another remark, asking your forbearance. I have never lived in an English-speaking country. Therefore, my English is pure Berlinese. And I hope by speaking slowly still to make myself understood even through this devastating undercutting good English. And you will have to forgive my shortcomings. I have a good optic memory, a very bad acoustic one. Among the Kabbalist teachings which present the greatest difficulties to scholarly penetration, special attention must be called to the doctrine of the particular, the individual spiritual shape. I would use the German term Gestalt of the essence of every human being. First expounded in the Zohar, the classical text of Spanish Kabbalism, where the biblical expression Tselem is used. Tselem occurs in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, in the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1:26, and chapter 9:6, in connection with the creation of man, and which, in a certain sense, is the basis of all anthropomorphic talk about God, called Tselem Elohim, the image of God. Tselem means in Hebrew originally a plastic image. A plastic image. Thus, when God says in the Bible, we want to make a man in our Tselem, in our image, and if it reads in the following verse, in God's Tselem, He created man, the physical plastic appearance of man is thereby put in relation to the primary shape, whatever it may be, portrayed in him. There exists then something like an image of God and a resemblance, demut in Hebrew, to him. It is not an object of ritual veneration, but it is something that describes the essence of man also in his corporality. As a portrait of a heavenly not necessarily bodily structure, this concept of the Tselem now passed through all stages of interpretation and reinterpretation, dictated by the desire for an ever-increasing emphasis on the divine transcendence and of the conception of God as spirit, which took many centuries to evolve in biblical religion. The mention of the creation of man in God's Tselem, as I said, was already problematical enough for the later monotheistic theologians. There is a highly interesting and sometimes even penetrating study, only marked by more than a few mistakes, of the interpretation of this famous verse in Genesis 1:26. God said, let us make a man in our image, Tselem, and after our likeness, Demut, by the Scandinavian scholar Jacob Jervil, written in German under the title Imago Dei, highly worth studying. Imago Dei. It's called Imago Dei im Spätjudentum. Spätjudentum, late Judaism, is a scandalous term coined by Protestant anti-Semitism, for which Judaism, as a religious phenomenon, ended with the ascendancy of Christianity, which is very difficult for a Jew to understand, for whom Judaism was in its full development and blooming and all through those later centuries. And Spätjudentum, what they called Spätjudentum, would be early Judaism and not late Judaism. But that's the way bias is working in theology or scholarship. These speculations provided the mystics with a clue for an intuition that was only very loosely connected with a biblical idea. Of importance to the Kabbalist was a question as to what really constituted the special individual essence of each human being, when the doctrine of transmigration of the soul, which was generally accepted by most of all the Kabbalists, was apt to put into doubt the specific uniqueness and irretrievability of human life. Life is lived once, and what you don't do in this life cannot be retrieved by somebody else. The doctrine of transmigration changed this and made the unit of life a rather cosmic unit, and not one time 70 years and that's all, and what you don't achieve here cannot be retrieved anywhere else. What could be was a question. What could be the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation of every single human existence, which could be retained even when transmigration was accepted, as it was in Kabbalah, where such a principle of individuation was unknown. Doubts about the whole theory of transmigration of the soul arose even amongst those who were favorably inclined towards Kabbalah. A mystic in Spain, like Isaac ibn Latif of Toledo, who lived around 1240 to 70, who wrote his books at this period, who took a position between the Kabbalah already crystallized in his own time and the philosophy of this time, and who between those years was writing before the famous book Zohar was published. He turns emphatically against transmigration. He even calls it a doctrine of heretical character and refutes it in his collection of mystical aphorisms and paradoxes. In a book called Rav Pe'alim, which was printed once, and the most remarkable text of Jewish mystical literature, to which the commentary added by the first editor in many places does not measure up at all. I hope there will be someday a new edition from this very remarkable collection of mystical paradoxes in Hebrew. Ibn Latif argues that with the acceptance of transmigration, the necessary individuating principle of each separate's existence would vanish and fall away. He evidently was not yet aware of the doctrine of that something inherent in man which belongs to each individual life as a specific element of its gestalt, and which already at that time was common knowledge in some conventicles of the Spanish Kabbalists. This moment of gestalt, which is evidently incompatible with the transmigration of the soul, and which the Zohar and other writings call the Tselem of man, gives rise to the question whether we have here a Kabbalistic form of the idea of the self as the deepest spiritual essence of man, or whether it is a version of the intuition or concept of man's astral body or psychic body, to use a Neoplatonic term living up to this very day, which constitutes a mediating and independent third realm in addition to the realms of body and soul. It is, of course, also possible to defend the hypothesis that these concepts are not mutually exclusive, but that man's occult self manifests itself precisely in this psychical or ethereal body of his. It goes without saying that the Tselem, being the essential pure gestalt of the individual, lent itself to different interpretations. Nevertheless, by way of the analysis of the Kabbalistic sources to be mentioned in this lecture, I would like to show that it is probably justified to assume that what we have here, though in very various forms, is a conception which sees the astral body as a constituting element of man. Without being directly connected with the details of the Kabbalistic psychology, doctrine of the soul and its parts, as it was developed following the psychology of Neoplatonism by the Spanish Kabbalists of the 13th century, as well as in the book Zohar, written in Guadalajara between the years 1280 and 85. We can fix the date of the author of the writing of the Zohar very precisely today. The intuition of something like a self, which, though not clearly defined, could make an appearance, occurs in a very curious Kabbalistic text, which we can use as our starting point here. In the beginning of the 16th century, a Kabbalist in Russia, there were very few Jews in proper Russia at that time, there was a certain Rabbi Moses ben Jacob from Kiev, of all places, who made a very valuable and interesting Kabbalistic anthology, a collection of various mysteries, 656, which in Hebrew correspond to the word Shushan. Shin, Shin, Waf, Nun is 656, and called his collection Shushan Sodot, meaning 656 mysteries. And this book, though available in print, was not read by too many people, certainly not by scholars. And the book has therefore received far too little attention from scholars. We find here an extremely remarkable discourse on the occult character of prophecy as self-confrontation. Man encountering his own self. A very original and highly curious and exciting explanation of the essence of prophecy. This passage, of which only parts have a known origin, is to be found nowhere else in its entirety in Kabbalistic literature. Though this compilation itself was written in 1509, the piece which is relevant for our consideration stems from the late 13th or the first years of the 14th centuries. It consists of several extracts from probably more or less contemporary writings, of which at least one can be identified as stemming from a disciple of the famous Rabbi Abraham Abulafia, a very famous Kabbalist of the second half of the 13th century in Castilia and Italy, about whom I have written a whole chapter in my book Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. The strongly personal character of the reports is particularly striking in Kabbalistic literature, where such personal confessions were considered undesirable. I have made several times the point, and I can only repeat it here, because it is certainly of some significance for the specific character of Jewish mysticism, that in obvious contradistinction to Christian and Islamic mysticism, which abound in confessions of an autobiographical character, some of them pure pearls of literature, like the writings of Al-Ghazali or other Islamic mystics, and the famous writings of the Catholic and Protestant mystics who could not speak enough about themselves and their own experience. The Kabbalists deeply disliked that kind of expression as a kind of some lack of decency. These things should not be divulged. What they write down is a kind of objectivation, and Kabbalistic literature is significantly poor, and certainly by intent, because certainly they have seen a lot of things, they have gone through a lot of experience of which they would not write. Therefore, testimonies of this kind are very rare in Jewish mystical literature, especially before the Sabbatian and later the Hasidic movement. The classical periods of Kabbalism in France, Spain, Germany, and Palestine in the 16th century have very little of it. And the fragment which I am going to quote is one of those exceptions. I quote from the Oxford manuscript of the complete text of the book, which is printed only in a garbled version. I quote, a great secret about the pronouncement of the Midrash, Hebrew literary writings of the 3rd to the 6th century of the Christian era. The pronouncement of the Midrash is, great is the strength of the prophets who make out a likeness between the created form and its former. Hamedamim Tzura leyotzera in Hebrew. One could also translate, who assimilate the form to him, God, who forms it. This is a famous saying in the non-mystical tradition, in the exoteric tradition. Our author says, although we have made an explanation about this in one of the foregoing paragraphs, and said what seems to us to be the meaning of this secret in a general way, but subsequently I found a piece about it by earlier authors, and my heart urges me to write it down because it directly provides an explanation of the foregoing. And this is the text of the report. I quote within a quote. The late, greatly learned Rabbi Nathan, I don't know who is Rabbi Nathan, it must have been a pupil of Abulafia or something around this circle, has told me, know you, that the complete secret of prophecy consists for the prophet in the fact that suddenly he sees the gestalt, the shape of his self standing before him, and he forgets his self and is disengaged from it, and he sees in front of himself the gestalt of himself as it speaks to him and reveals the future to him. And of this secret, our sages have said, great is the power of the prophets who assimilate the form to him who forms it. And thus says also added edition of the collector of the book. Thus also says the learned Rabbi Abraham ben Ezra, a famous biblical commentator of the 12th century in France and Spain. The hearer of prophecy is a human being, and the speaker is a human being. He doesn't say that it's the same, but at any rate he says that who speaks is human and who hears is human, which is quite a statement to make regarding to prophecy. And obviously the Kabbalist thinks that Ibn Ezra means the hearer is the same as those who speaks. And another scholar writes about this the following. A quote within a quote. On the strength of the combination of divine names and solitary meditation, I have experienced what I have reported in the book Shari Tzedek about the light that walks with me. This quotation is found in a text which I have translated from the Hebrew in the chapter on Abulafia in my book Major Mysticism, where there is a long autobiographical tale, very rare, as I said, where the author speaks of seeing a light that emanates from himself and which accompanies him wherever he is walking in his home. A long description of mystical experiences he has undergone. But I have not been found worthy of meeting the gestalt of myself standing before me, and this is beyond my power. And again, and another scholar writes the following, quote within a quote, I know and am aware with complete certainty that I am neither prophet nor the son of a prophet, that the Holy Spirit does not reside in me, and I have no power over the heavenly voice. This heavenly voice is a kind of revelation below that of the Holy Spirit, frequently referred to in the Talmud. I have no power about the heavenly voice, for of all these things I have not been found worthy, and I did not take off my dress and did not wash my feet, which is a Kabbalistic metaphor for ecstasy. And yet I call heaven and earth as my witness. My witness is in heaven, and my testimony up high, that one day I sat and wrote down a Kabbalistic secret, and all of a sudden I saw the gestalt of myself standing before me, and myself was disengaged from me, and I was forced and compelled to stop writing. And now the compilator of the collection adds, likewise, when we, Rabbi Moses of Jacob, compiled this book and vocalized the undisguised name of God, there appeared before our eyes disturbing things, something like red fire at sunset, until we were confused thereby and ceased to write. And this happened to us many times at being occupied with the present world. Unquote. That's a text. Very curious text. The strong emotion accompanying the reports of at least 3 of the authors quoted by the collector is unmistakable. 2 of them have seen their own self, in Hebrew, etzem, the self. They have seen their self. Some think the third author, whose report on his mystical experience has been preserved and with which we are acquainted through the aforementioned book Shari Tzedek, regarded as a highest stage of mystical experience, which was not granted to him because it is prophecy. See, meeting yourself in some sudden act, talking to you. I have in vain searched in mystical literature for such an explanation outside this text which I have been quoting. I have been unable for the time being to find outside Judaism or outside Kabbalism such an explanation of prophecy as self-confrontation. The prophets, on the other hand, had gone through precisely this experience in which their pure self transmits to them the prophetic message. What confronts them is not something basically different from themselves, such as perhaps a manifestation of the Godhead or of an angel dispatched to them at hoc, but their own pure form. What is called here the self remains undefined with respect to the traditional classification of the degrees of the soul taken over from the Platonists, 3 degrees of the soul in Platonic teaching. There are even valid reasons for arguing that this self is an angelic self, connected with the essential nature of man, some kind of as a personal angel, essentially belonging to every man and becoming visible to men in this experience. On the other hand, the emphasis on the moment of self-remoteness or disengagement and self-forgetting in this experience. The man stands before himself, he's disengaged from him. There's a projection of something in him, of his pure self, opposing him. Speaks for the fact that these Kabbalists were seeking in this self something emerging from the depths of human nature itself, which is generally hidden therein. The latter may rather fit a conception of the self as some kind of ethereal body, becoming independent, whilst the first conception points in a different direction. Yet it is also doubtful if the difference lies as deep as would appear at first glance. The self deeply hidden in men, or something of the self projected outside. Two quite different conceptions, which are somehow connected here. The difference may not be as deep as would appear. I have translated above the Hebrew expressions as precisely as possible. But in the spirit of Hebrew linguistic usage, one could also translate the decisive words less strictly. One could say his own image instead of the image of his self. In Hebrew, you have no way to decide if to call something the Mut Atzmi, the gestalt of myself, or my own gestalt. It is up to you to decide. The Hebrew makes possible both translations. You could say disengage from myself instead of myself disengaged from me. So that the problem posed by the terminology of the self would actually not arise at all in the text. It might be there, given the precise translation, it might not be there. We have no way, because there are no other parallel texts to this remarkable quotation, which would help us in the matter. One who sees himself perceives in the view of many reporters and researchers in the field an independent emanation of his being or his own essence, which might very well be regarded as what in other traditions is called an astral body that could be projected out of your being into something else. The problem, of course, of the astral body as a possible projection, as something connected with man and with man's being, is a phenomenon well known from Indian and Oriental experience, as well as from Neoplatonic and other Western traditions up to our very day, where a considerable number of literature has been published on such problems. I mention here only to give examples of very interesting discussions of such of this problem, not being a pure speculative thing, but something which lots of people have experienced. I would like to mention two books here by Sylvan Muldoon and Hereward Carrington. One, The Projection of the Astral Body, which has been published in London 1929, and by the same authors, The Phenomenon of Astral Projection, first London 1951, and reprinted several times. This latter volume, which I studied only recently, is based on contemporary evidence and tries to show that the phenomenon is by far not so rare as commonly assumed. These authors discuss 200 cases of contemporary experience gone through by people in several countries of quite reliable character, where people had this same experience, of course not reinterpreting it in the way our Kabbalists did. I would like to give you the name of the authors. This is Muldoon and Sylvain. Muldoon, Sylvain, and Carrington, H. Carrington, the two authors. And of course, I think many of you may know that phenomena of this kind occur equally among the lamas of Tibet, the shamans of Siberia, the Zulu of Southern Africa, and to ladies and gentlemen living in London, Paris, New York, or whatever you have. It's a common experience of many people. In Kabbalistic literature, this intuition is closely connected with other motives, which the history of religion of late antiquity and the Neoplatonism of the Middle Ages have reserved in quite parallel contexts. Particularly distinct, even striking, is a connection between the above-mentioned accounts and the particular traditions on what is called in Arabic the perfect nature of man is a term, a fixed term, and its appearance as man's own daimon, idios daimon, it would be called in Neoplatonic writings, idios daimon, the own daemon of man, which is conceived by Jamblichus, for instance, as a personal angel of man. This idea of something which is a personal daimon of man was preserved in a number of texts on early medieval occultism in Arabic. Above all, reference should be made here to the famous work Rayat al-Hakim, the aim or purpose of the sage, Rayat al-Hakim, which has been published only in our generation, from a very famous book in Arabic occultism, which also exists in many Latin versions under the curious title Picatrix, P-I-C-A-T-R-I-X, a work described by Helmut Ritter, the editor of the Arabic text, as a kind of Arabic handbook of Hellenistic magic, because the material in these books is not Arabic at all. It is purely Hellenistic. Some of it can be traced to its Greek origins. Much of it goes back to late Greek traditions, which have not been preserved so far in their original Greek, but certainly had some original Greek. This compilation from the most variegated pseudo-epigraphic sources of primarily hermetic character, some of which are, by the way, still preserved in manuscript form, contains several pieces about the magical invocation of a pneumatic being, a spiritual being, which is a perfect nature of the conjurer himself. This being proves rather invariably to be a metamorphosis of the personal or own daimon, which makes its first explicit appearance in the Greek magical papyri, in a conjuring up of the idios daimon, the daimon of the own self, found in a papyrus of the British Museum to this very day, and about whose essence the Neoplatonist Jamblichos of the 4th century subsequently developed a whole theory and theurgic praxis, how to get about it, in his book about the mysteries by Jamblichos, a famous book of Neoplatonic mysticism. It's interesting that Jamblichos never it identifies this personal daimon with the astral body. He mentions both of them, but in different connections and contexts, and never says that one is identical with the other. The coalescence of the two concepts, the personal daimon and the astral body, my opinion, that is not a Jewish book. No Jew would call his son Lamech. You can believe me. Lamech in Jewish parlance is a goylem, is a fool. But the English version calls the man Abramelin. It is obviously a non-Jewish text written in the beginning of the 16th century by somebody who knew about Kabbalah from the writings of Pico della Mirandola, which can be proved, in my opinion. I was at time I thought it might be a Jewish text. If it would be a Jewish text, it's very interesting. I no longer believe it's a Jewish text. You know, philology works against your own inclinations. But the book concerns is a kind of Jewish, who certainly was written by a man who knew Hebrew quite well, better than other Christians of this age, I would say. I have studied the book quite often, and it concerns the conjuration of your own personal angel, exactly what Eleazar says it cannot be done. He does it as a Jew, but I don't believe it. I think it is some Neoplaton. He took it not from Jewish sources, but from other ones. Although it has a long, long autobiographical introduction about the feats he has done, the tremendous feats he has done in his magical career among the Gentiles. Though the book is a very curious one. Anyway, and whether this is Jewish tradition or not, I doubt. Under this aspect, one can understand the references in the Zohar to the Tselem, although they presuppose a much further developed form of Kabbalistic psychology. The idea of a thoroughly personally conceived angel has been replaced in the book Zohar by a pre-existential archetype called Diokna, in Aramaic Gestalt. Diokna, a Greek word, Diakon, Diokna, the Zohar is written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Therefore, the terms are mostly Aramaic, pseudo-Aramaic, if I may say. What he thought to be Aramaic. The idea I said is here not of an angel, but of a pre-existential archetype, the Yokna, and above all, by a pre-existential heavenly robe or attire, which clothes the soul during its prenatal paradisic existence. For also the pure spirits and souls, even in their paradisic states, are in need of a garb, of a covering, which the Zohar takes to be ethereal, and which made of ether, and which they only shed in quite extraordinary circumstances, when they sometimes only appear naked, as the Zohar says, before God. In general, even the purest spirit need a garb. No pure spiritual being exists without some garb. The Zohar contains long speculations about these robes or garbs of the souls, making reference to older sources of the Spanish Kabbalah and developing them further for its own purposes. Now, this ethereal robe is also conceived by the Zohar as, at the same time, as a spiritual body, which thus becomes able to embrace and assimilate the Neoplatonic idea of the astral body, agoades soma, which I have mentioned, though on a different psychological basis. The strictly Neoplatonic form of this idea was known also in Jewish medieval literature, and is found, for instance, in a treatise on the nature of the soul, written in Arabic by a Jew in Spain in the midst of the 11th century, by a Jewish Neoplatonist in Andalusia. According to this, there exists, apart from the grossly material body which is perceived by the senses, another subtle body that is beyond sensual perception, and which acquires its characteristics entirely in the spirit of Platonic and Neoplatonic psychology, while passing through the spheres of the heavenly bodies according to their relative specific character. It acquires its character going through the spheres. This astral body, Jism al-Falkiya in Arabic, as it is rightly called there, represents something in between the body and the soul proper, which differ too much from one another, body and soul, in order to be capable of influencing each other directly. This is a basic point to all these ideas, that body and soul are not near enough to be able to tolerate each other. The body, the real soul, cannot immediately communicate and adapt itself to the body. It has need of some medium, some mediating thing, which is a subtle body in Neoplatonism and in all these subsequent ideas, including, as it comes out, Kabbalistic speculation. This author, who is unknown, anonymous, says, I quote, "When the soul passes through the heavenly bodies, which means the spheres of the stars and planets, it acquires an astral body, through which it becomes materialized," unquote. Whereas the Kabbalists may have taken over the idea of the mediating function of the astral body from philosophical tradition, yet for the characterization of the proper essence of this body, they came back to the Iranian, Persian idea of the paradisic robes of life, called in sources, which are woven from light or from heavenly ether, which was adapted by Judaism in the book of Enoch, in the apocryphal pseudepigraphical literature on the Old Testament, and in the Jewish Merkaba literature of the first centuries. Conceived this way, the ethereal body, which belongs to every earthly body, is defined by the Zohar as the Tselem, expressive verbis. But at the same time, it becomes a biological principle which is active in the human organism and changes its shape together with the human body in its biological development. It is implanted in the soul at the time of conception, grows with the individual and retires from him, before his death. Death is announced by a kind of retirement of this Tselem from its place. Only in one place at the Zohar, it is expressly stated that this is really the Tselem mentioned in the passage of the book of Genesis on the creation of man. But also in other places where it is called so, there can be no doubt about this identity. In the Zohar, precisely as in a famous passage in the 25th canto of Dante's Purgatorio, this astral body is connected with the shadow of man. This play of words is made easy in Hebrew, interesting enough, where Tselem contains the word sail. Sail, meaning shadow. The Hebrew, the biblical word for shadow. The Tselem has some relation, has some connection with the Tsel. It seems that the Zohar regards man's shadow as a projection of the inner Tselem, thus opening the door to various magic and folkloristic ideas about the shadow, into which I do not have to go in this context. Would take another hour. In the Zohar, we read about this. I quote, "In the hour when a man is about to unite with his wife with holy intention, a holy spirit composed of male and female elements is awakened above him, and God summons an angelic messenger who is in charge of the conception of human children, places that spirit into his charge, and lets him know the place to which he should bring it, where he should be born." And about this it says in the book of Job, chapter 3, "He said tonight a man has been conceived." This is to say, he said to the angel, which according to Talmudic tradition is in charge of conception, whose name is Laila, night, a male has been conceived by NN. And God instructs this spirit on everything he wishes to teach him, as this has been explained in other sources. There is an old midrash stemming from the 4th or 5th century at latest, about called the midrash on the creation of the embryo, of the human embryo, where this idea that the embryonic being of man wanders through the heavens under the guidance of an angel who shows him the whole world, and at the moment of birth he learns all the secrets of the cosmos, and at the moment of birth the angel gives him, and he forgets all, and whatever he learns is like Platonic anamnesis. He recalls, he relearns what he has said, and this is why man has, how do you call it, a cleft, because of the stub of the angel who made him forget his heavenly Torah. Thereupon, that spirit descends, namely the soul, descends, and with him together a Gestalt, Tselem, Zulma in Aramaic, Zulma, namely the whose form he existed in the heavenly paradise. In this Tselem he is created. In this Tselem, you can also translate with this Tselem, he wanders around on earth. And of this it is said in Psalm 39, "Ye men wanders in the Tselem, ach b'Tselem yahalech ish." So long as this Tselem is with him, man can exist in this world. Come and behold, at the hour when the soul descends in order to enter this world, It descends from the heavenly paradise where it has its pre-existential place to the earthly paradise. There are two kinds of paradise, a higher one and an earthly one. And sees there the glory of the spirits of the just standing in a row. Therefore it visits hell thereafter. It visits hell and sees the sinners who cry woe to us without receiving mercy. And it is given testimony of all this. And that holy Tselem hovers above it until it goes into the netherworld. As soon as it goes out into the world, this Tselem, when the child is born, the Tselem approaches it and joins it and grows with it, as it is said, ye men wanders in the Tselem. And in this Tselem, man's days are predestined. The Tselem it is that contains the predestination of man's days on earth, and depend upon this. And of this it is said in the book of Job in chapter 8, for our days are a shadow of the Tselem, which is also an omen for the duration of man's life, is nothing else but the externalization of the Tselem. The shadow is the externalization, the projection into the outward visible world of the inner Tselem. Here then, two notions are distinctly connected. On the one hand, the Tselem is a prenatal principle. On the other hand, it is at the same time the biological individual life principle which already comprises the growth of the organism and the duration of its life. Tselem is not conceived as a robe of the soul, but instead letting it hover above it. It's not clothing it in the it is somehow hovering above man. While in other passages, though the term Tselem is not explicitly used there, the same function in the Zohar is ascribed to the raiment of the soul. For just as man's days are here predestined in the Tselem, in another passage which speaks of what is called the robe of the days, levush hayamim, the robe woven of days. The robe of the days is mentioned in a famous passage of the Zohar, which the soul is donning, and which it is simultaneously waving by means of its deeds on earth. It is woven from the deeds of men. Therefore, the robe woven of days. The author of the Zohar evidently had before him two different traditions which he combines. For the one, the attire of the soul, the robe, is predestined, includes its days on earth, and enters into the seed of man, and into the growing body as an astral body. For the other one, it is woven from the good deeds of the human being, and then accompanies him back into the upper paradisical regions after death. I quote, "It is said of Abraham that he grew old." In Genesis 24, he attained a great age, namely by virtue of his good deeds. And this word should be understood with mystical precision. For when he ascended from this world, Abraham came into those days with which he had clothed himself, and nothing was lacking of this precious attire. You understand? Your deeds make it out whether your day will be an element woven into your robe. If you sin on this day will be lacking from your robe. And those days which have been without good deeds will be like your robe will, will be defect. And therefore man weaves his own attire from his deeds. Now it is clear that the latter represents a tradition that can be traced back historically and unequivocally to the Iranian idea of the Daena, in Iranian eschatology, Daena, which had a long career in the history of Western and Eastern religions at the same time. The Daena is a gestalt which, according to the eschatology of Masterism, meets the deceased as his own higher self, but which at the same time is conceived as originating from his own good deeds that correspond to just this true self. The two ideas come together already in the Iranian idea of Masterism, which precedes the other ones, the other ideas. This, of course, is not to be understood as if the Zohar used Iranian sources. It can be shown that this idea first passed, on the one hand, into Islamic eschatology, where it is attested in several traditions, hadith, by the famous traditionalist al-Bukhari. Bukhari lived around, died in 870, who collected the oral traditions put out in the name of Muhammad, and thence became disseminated in Jewish circles too. A famous rabbi of North Africa, Jacob ben Nissim of Kairawan, who died in 1062, 200 years before the Zohar, in his collection of stories about the deeds of the righteous, which he compiled in Arabic and which was translated later into Hebrew in the 11th or 12th century, tells among others a tale of a pious Jew whose robe was still unfinished. It says his robe was still unfinished, and which he brought to completion, to perfection, by an exercise of rather extravagant piety. I cannot go into the detail. He sold his wife into slavery. It's a long story, very extremely paradoxical, like most of the stories of Hasidim, of real extravagantly pious men, which are mostly have a very paradoxical tinge. It can be proved that the book Zohar and the author used the Hebrew translation of this anthology of stories as one of its sources. It can be proved without any doubt. Its eschatological imagination wavers between the different conceptions, sometimes keeping them apart, and at other times combining them, side by side, with the attractive conception of the attire for the beyond, made of men's good deeds, which must be put together by you. There exists another notion according to which the paradisic pre-existential attire is the same which the soul dons again after death. So it's there. There's some, it is prenatal there. It is pre-existent, and on the other side, it's woven by your deeds. It wavers between the two concepts. Both ideas are combined by the author in the notion of the Tselem. The Tselem is the attire of days as a principle of life, but it is also the cloak from the upper regions which together with the soul enters the gross material body and withdraws from him before death, thus obviously returning to the upper regions. Therefore it is really a mixture between man's self and his astral body. It is obviously in the second sense that the famous Kabbalist Moses Cordovero in the 16th century in Safed speaks of the withdrawal of the Tselem 30 days before man's death. It begins to retire from man. In a further passage of the Zohar, we are told from an alleged book of the King of Solomon, non-existing in the heavenly library, that at the moment of coupling, God sends a gestalt which already has the exact physiognomy of the developing being, and which is inscribed and imprinted in this Tselem. I quote, "And it hovers above his union," of man and woman, "and if permission would be given to the eye from above to see," meaning if men were capable of such spiritual experience of perception, "men would behold above his head a shape having the form of the physiognomy of man, and in this Tselem man is created. And so long as this Tselem, sent to him by God, does not stand and hover above his head, no human being can be created by this union. As it is written, and God created man in his Tselem. For this Tselem is prepared for him before he goes out into the netherworld, and it says, ye in the Tselem man walks. At the hour when the spirits which are to enter into man emerge from their heavenly places, each spirit closes itself in front of the holy King of God in precious shapes, according to the physiognomy it will bear in its earthly existence. The Tselem is yourself, in a way. It has your own physiognomy of the created being. And from this precious prototype emerges the Tselem, taking third place after the spirit. There are 3 degrees, it says, and it enters the world for the first time at the time of coupling, and there exists no union in this world where the Tselem does not stand between the couple. Unquote. The designation of the Tselem as a third element in relation to the spirit can be easily explained by the psychology of the Zohar, where also the living soul, the Nefesh, ranks below the spirit, so that the Tselem constitutes the third element which mediates between this lowest spiritual sphere and the body as such. This definition proves that the author conceived the Tselem as representing the astral body. Further on, in this passage, the Zohar says that Israel received this Tselem from the holy regions, whereas the heathen obtain theirs from the unclean and demonic sources. The conception that the Tselem bears the physiognomic features of this specific human being is known to us already from Eleazar of Worms. Therefore, if the Tselem would externalize itself and become visible to men in an act of occult experience, this would be a phenomenon of a double in which man encounters himself. The parallel of the notion of the gestalt of man's own self, which confronts him, mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, is thus clearly marked here. Indeed, in the writings of Moses Cordovero of Safed, who discusses the doctrine of the Tselem as astral body in his great manual of Kabbalah written in 1548, we find the remark that the Tselem has a quality of being visually perceivable by some of the pious already in this world. So the experience happens to some people. This same occult experience of the Tselem as the ethereal body of the just, which can be projected and can be seen, is also mentioned by the famous Kabbalist Chaim Vital, the chief disciple of Isaac Loya, who, by the way, also propounds the remarkable theory that the astral body is necessary as mediator between soul and body, since otherwise the soul would burn the body upon entering it. It would be too strong in its spirituality, as the body would not be able to withstand it. Two additional details should be mentioned in the context of this doctrine of the Zohar. The one speaking of man's death is the further claim that the Tselem consists of two interconnected parts, of which Solomon is said to have been saying in the Song of Songs, before the day break and the shadows, Tselalim in Hebrew, flee away, where the shadows, Tselalim, are obviously identical with the plural of Tselem, Tselamim, Tselalim. We are not informed how to conceive of the nature of this duality, but we may suppose that the author had in mind the Talmudic notion of a shadow of shadow, which appears only in passing. In a further passage, as already mentioned, in the Zohar, the conception of the Tselem as an astral body is combined with that of the attire of the soul, which it dons before birth and also in paradise after death. This quasi-unsubstantial attire of subtle matter, representing the holy ethereal or pneumatic body in which the blessed souls are clothed, corresponds to the subtle ether, which is the air of paradise. There's a special air in paradise which is not identical with the rather, how do you call it, now everybody's speaking what our surrounding is dirty. Yes. Prior to the appearance of the Zohar, the Kabbalah, continuing the tradition of older literature, only knew an ethereal body to which man was entitled after death. With this assumption, Moses ben Nachman, a famous Kabbalist one generation before the Zohar, and his disciples explained mainly also the spiritistic phenomena of the occasional appearance of the spirits of the dead in a sort of astral body among the living. But in most ancient Kabbalistic writings, there is always a raiment in which the soul clothes itself after death, or which the transfigured Enoch or Elijah donned during their ascent to heaven. Only after having shed the unclean guise of their earthly body can they assume the radiant body of splendor, as the Zohar calls it. In the same sense, Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachman, explains the paradoxical comment of the Talmud on Genesis 49 that Jacob, whose death is recounted in this chapter of the Bible, did not die at all. The soul of the just man dons a splendid gown in the realm of the blessed so as not to remain unclothed, and sometimes shows itself in this gown on earth, as it is recounted in several passages of the Talmud. Some of the disciples who wrote super commentaries to the Kabbalistic passages in Nachmanides' famous commentary on the Torah have read, probably more correctly in their copies, about a levush sheni, a second attire, which the soul puts on after death. Thus the soul dons in place of its terrestrial body a second gown, with which it may only wear in its beatific blessed state. Such Yet the Zohar also contains a passage that seems to support the view that the conception of man's higher self, being his Tselem, was known as his guardian angel and was as such taken over into the Jewish terminology of the Tselem. In connection with an interpretation of Genesis 9:2, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. Into your hand are they delivered, which is interpreted in the Zohar quite frequently. It says that Daniel's rescue from the lion's den is explained by the fact that it was man's primordial form which frightened the wild beasts, meaning the pure manifestation of the Tselem in him, through which he was saved. Tselem chases away the wild beasts because it's in God's Tselem. It's a divine image. The argument that it is explicitly said in the book of Daniel that it was an angel sent by God who closed the lion's mouth is countered in the Zohar by a daring reinterpretation to the fact that this pure primordial form, Yukna, in other words, the Tselem, was in fact an angel who guarded him. God sent to Daniel just his own Tselem, described here as that angel in whom all the forms of the world are imprinted. But this is a standing definition of in the Zohar of man's mystical primordial shape, namely a shape in which all the forms of the world are imprinted. Man being a microcosmos, all worldly forms are imprinted in man. He's connected with everything and having an effect by his deeds on everything, because all the forms of creation are in man. Therefore, the just man possesses his original form, his Tselem, also as his guardian angel, this idea being hardly different from that of the perfect nature of which I have spoken in the first part. But we can go further and recognize the identity of the Tselem with the perfect nature of the Hermetic text in yet another unmistakable detail. Of both of them, the perfect nature and the Tselem, it is said with so many words that they grow simultaneously with man's psychophysical organism. From the Iranian tradition of the Daena and from the Gnostic splendid attire of the soul in a famous hymn preserved in the Acts of Thomas, it clearly emerges that this growth has yet another aspect, namely a moral metaphysical one. His higher self grows with man's good deeds in the sense of those religions. Both these directions of the concepts are preserved in the Zohar as already suggested above. The identification of the Tselem with the astral body, which as far as I know was first introduced by the Zohar, was later taken up by the Kabbalists. I quote one writing around 1400. The Tselem enters into an association with the drop of semen, and from this semen seed the human body is formed, and the soul is connected with it, and it surrounds it from all sides through the medium of the Tselem, and through this Tselem the body develops and grows. It is both a biological principle and a principle of individuation. And the Tselem is also subtle and invisible. It is a pneumatic body with all the powers of the soul in a physical yet hidden manner, and only thereon are built the body at its strength, and this is the meaning God created man in his Tselem, that is in something which is designated for him alone as principium individuationis, and which provides the connection between body and soul. The conception of the Tselem as an astral body is there combined with that of the attire of the soul, and this quasi-unsubstantial attire of subtle matter, representing also the holy ethereal or pneumatic body in which the blessed souls are clothed, corresponds to the subtle ether, which is the air of paradise. Prior to the appearance of the Zohar, the Kabbalah, continuing here the tradition of pre-Kabbalistic literature, knew but an ethereal body to which man was entitled after death. Now it because now things change, and we get this comment that Jacob, as I said, did not die. The atmosphere of these eschatological discussions in the school of Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, which I quoted, is already quite similar to that of the Zohar, which was written in Castell about 15 years after the death of Moses ben Nachman. Only one commentator on this passage in his commentary has drawn the further consequence of defining in its commentary the second gown of the soul as already present in man's earthly body. Now this is clearly this astral body. This is Joseph Angelino of Saragossa, who wrote in 1325 and doubtless knew the Zohar, which he frequently quotes. I quote, "The soul, due to its subtleness which stems from the upper regions, cannot enter into communion with the grossly material body until it wraps itself in a gown of subtle matter from the upper regions, though its subtleness is not equal to its own, which is even less material. And this is called the second gown, with the aid of which it enters into communion with the body. Now when the soul leaves the body, this second gown still remains to the soul, to cover its nakedness, and by virtue of its connection with that gown, it retains its longing for the body when the dead are resurrected. And this is a secret which is concealed in visions, meaning that the subtle body of man is the one part which guarantees the body resurrection at the time of the resurrection of the dead in a Kabbalistic explanation. I dare not decide whether the final words, secret concealed in visions, were meant to suggest, as may be possible, that this explanation was based upon an occult experience of the authors, or whether they are intended to describe the doctrine of the astral body as such a mystery. Thus we can see here that for Joseph Angelino, the astral body, which is not affected by death, coincides with the Tselem of the Zohar. Beginning with this late 14th century, this theory becomes the prevalent doctrine of the Kabbalists, and it also dominates the relevant interpretations of later Kabbalists of Safed in Palestine during the 16th and 17th century. Their explanations developed in a direction parallel to those of their contemporaries in the Christian world in Europe. Very clear. The people of Safed long right ago here in the Upper Galilee, and the Platonic, Neoplatonic philosophers and hermetists of the 16th century developed the same theory without any visible filiation of an historical character being discovered. With the Kabbalists, however, parallel to their progressively complicated psychology, the doctrine of the different manifestation of the Tselem now also becomes in later Kabbalism increasingly complicated. Each element of the soul, which could lead an independent existence through transmigration of the soul, is allotted its own gown or Tselem of its own that would enable that part of the soul to be effective in the body of man. These coverings of the soul, like the souls themselves, have their origins in the higher regions of divine emanation and in the hidden worlds that correspond to it. Thus also, they themselves already constitute projections of higher luminous beings into the earthly existence of the soul. Especially the two Kabbalists, Chaim Vital and Menachem Azaria Fano, the most famous Kabbalist of Italy, who died in 1623, whereas Vital died in 1620. Both of the great lights of Kabbalism of the later times. Especially these two, who saw writing in Italy and Safed, seems to be entirely under the influence of the Safed Kabbalists. These complications still constantly retain the conception of the Tselem as an astral body, and therewith also the possibility of ascertaining its perception in occult experiences of men. With all this, the experience of confronting one's own self as the highest initiation with which we started out here is still preserved by the latest Kabbalists, who explain it by referring to the quotation from the Shushan Sodot with which we discuss at the beginning. Jacob Frank, the latest famous leader of the last stage of Sabbatianism in the second half of the 18th century, is still aware of this idea. He predicts to his adherents, whom he promises to lead to the mystical Jacob, which is himself, which is a patriarch Jacob, and which is Jacob Frank, the third of the patriarchs, whom he promised to lead to the mystical Jacob, and his brother Esau, the worldly brother of the spiritual Jacob, if they will rid themselves of all external forms and rituals in an antinomian nihilism. I cannot see myself yet, because my body is still too coarsely material. Thus the vision of one's own self is being transformed at the end from a prophetic into a messianic experience, in which man encounters himself when arriving at the place of redemption, which according to this doctrine of religious nihilism is at the same time the place where all other forms and shapes dissolve into nothingness. Thank you.